No wrestler was ever more synonymous with World Championship Wrestling in any of its incarnations than the Nature Boy, Ric Flair. Whether the poster boy for boisterousness and decadence, or a valiant ring general taking on all comers, Flair transcended the business as both a character and as an in-ring performer. When he left WCW in 1991 following a series of disputes with then head honcho Jim Herd, the shockwave devastated WCW's core audience, who struggled to conceive just how Herd of anyone could have let the celebrated heart of the territory leave for the WWF. 7 years later, in the midst of the heated Monday Night Wars, history came precariously close to repeating itself as Ric Flair found himself at highly contentious odds with WCW President Eric Bischoff. Flair wasn't exactly being used as a featured player come the spring of 1998. Half a year earlier, the Four Horsemen all but dissolved following a heartbreaking loss in War Games to the New World Order, after New Horseman Kurt Hennig double-crossed his partners. After scrapping with Hennig over the months ahead, Flair suddenly pivoted into a one-off feud with fellow babyface Bret Hart. The Hitman won an oft-forgotten Battle of the Icons at January's sold-out pay-per-view, and from there, Flair pretty much went adrift. Over the next 3 months, Flair only wrestled 3 times on television, one of them a fairly random bout against Brad Armstrong on an episode of Nitro. Though still a highly regarded performer at the age of 49, these weren't exactly Flair's best days. In fact, the only thing truly notable about Flair in this period is that, according to him, he was wrestling without a contract. Flair claims that his deal with WCW expired on February 16, 1998. 3 months earlier, in November 1997, Flair says that he received a letter of agreement from the company that outlined the terms of a new 3-year deal. He wanted his new deal to include reasonable involvement in storylines, fair treatment, and in his words, legitimate consideration of my experience and status as a multiple-time world champion. For him, money wasn't the sticking point, it was about making sure his image and reputation could not be sullied at the whim of creative and/or management. You see, barely 7 years had passed since Jim Herd suggested recasting Flair as an earring-wearing gladiator, which is gobbledygooker levels of surreal. So, in other words, Flair was being image-conscious. When he received that letter of agreement, he claims none of these considerations were listed therein, and thus he never signed a formal contract, he just continued to work for the company during the ongoing impasse. And work Flair did, performing at house shows in early April 1998 in Florida against Hennig. After defeating his former on-screen confidant at a live event on Wednesday the 8th in Fort Pierce, Florida, the impression was that Flair was bound for Tallahassee for the next day's episode of WCW Thunder. In fact, Flair had been advertised for the broadcast. And his appearance wasn't going to be some throwaway match or segment either. According to the Wrestling Observer newsletter, Flair was going to announce the reformation of the Four Horsemen, a new incarnation of the classic group that would have reportedly included Bill Goldberg as a member. But Flair never made it to Tallahassee. In fact, he wasn't even intending to go there. After the event in Fort Pierce, he flew home in preparation to fly out to Detroit to be with his 10-year-old son Reed, who was competing in the AAU National Wrestling Tournament. According to Flair, he had given prior notice to the company that he would not be at that Thunder on that particular date because of his son's tournament. The Observer notes that while Flair claimed to have asked for the time off well in advance, he was told the Monday before that he had to be in Tallahassee for Thunder, but Flair had no intention of missing his son's big moment. Bischoff got a hold of Flair and made it clear that he had to be in Tallahassee. As part of the order, Flair claims that WCW offered to charter him a flight from Detroit to Tallahassee, presumably to get in, film the angle, and get back. Flair also adds that WCW stipulated that he pay half of the airfare, to which he told them to sit and swivel. Bischoff was furious. He contends that Flair was in breach of contract, which is to suggest that Bischoff felt Flair had a valid deal in place. He wrote, "There was a procedure in place to follow if anyone wanted time off. In my opinion, Ric Flair did not follow that procedure." Nitro was held in Minneapolis 4 days later on April 13th, which the mayor had deemed to be Ric Flair Day in the city. That same night, WWF Raw ended its near 2-year ratings futility streak against Nitro by winning the head-to-head battle on account of Steve Austin challenging Vince McMahon to a match. But while that kayfabe battle of superstar versus boss was playing out, a very real one was taking place across enemy lines. Flair was nowhere to be seen as Bischoff addressed the WCW locker room before the show, so the WCW shot caller laid out his case, claiming that Flair promised to be at all televised events and that requests for any days off had to be submitted in writing with at least 10 days' notice. Dave Meltzer points out that where Bischoff may have had a point is in Flair's timing. Reed's qualification for the AAU Nationals wouldn't have been confirmed until shortly before the Nationals took place, and if that's true, then perhaps Flair couldn't have known to ask for the tournament dates off that far in advance. But that's also just speculation. Meltzer theorizes that because Flair had been off TV for so long without being given a concrete return date, he may not have felt obliged to have even asked for that date off, and only had his televised comeback sprung on him relatively late in the game. Bischoff then continued his sermon, and it was apparently a doozy. He went in on the absent Nature Boy, calling him a swerve artist as well as a liar, saying that everybody lets him get away with it just because he's Ric Flair. He promised to make an example of him, vowing to sue him into bankruptcy. As Guy Evans' book Nitro claims, Bischoff seethed to his assembled roster, "I'm going to starve Flair, I'm going to cause him to move out to the streets." The gist of which then mid-card wrestler Chris Jericho recalled and confirmed years later. Bischoff wasn't about to fire Flair though. Even if the WWF was starting to ride high on the momentum of its youthful attitude movement, an iconic and valuable figure like Flair could have found a place in their upper echelon once more. According to Flair, during the earlier contract squabble, he spoke with longtime friend Jim Cornette, who was at the time a WWF official. Cornette believed Vince would want Flair back, and Flair strongly considered a move. Amid all of the ongoing dissension between Flair and Bischoff following the Tallahassee no-show and subsequent Bischoff backstage tirade, Flair toyed with the idea of attending WWF's April pay-per-view Unforgiven, which happened to be running local in Greensboro, North Carolina. On WWF Raw 6 days before the pay-per-view, Jim Ross made sure to note on commentary that Unforgiven was taking place in Ric Flair country, capitalizing on the feverish internet rumor mill. Flair even revealed that there was an idea which has since been corroborated by both Cornette and Bruce Pritchard, where he and son Reed would actually be shown on camera in the front row. Jim Ross would come over during the pay-per-view to conduct an interview with a great wrestling champion, only for it to be amateur wrestling champion Reed instead of his dad. But Rick would be standing there as a proud father, a clear middle finger in Bischoff's direction. Flair was apparently outside the Greensboro Coliseum that night in a car, speaking over the phone with the likes of Cornette, McMahon, and one of his attorneys. Ultimately, it was decided that due to his contractual status with WCW, however ambiguous, it wouldn't be wise to have him appear on WWF television in any form without clear resolution, lest messy litigation ensue. Besides, legal maneuvering had already begun. On Friday, April 17th in Fulton County Superior Court, WCW officially sued Flair for breach of contract to the tune of $2 million. The suit claimed that Flair's non-attendance of the Tallahassee Thunder, the Minneapolis Nitro, and other ensuing dates played havoc with the script of the wildly popular productions. Of the Four Horsemen reunion that never materialized, the lawyer claimed that by not attending Thunder, Flair disrupted WCW's ability to introduce its planned storyline, causing significant loss of time, money, and effort by WCW. On Tuesday, April 21st, in between the filing and the pay-per-view, settlement talks began between Bischoff and Flair and their representatives. Flair wanted to renegotiate the terms of the contract he reportedly hadn't even signed yet, while Bischoff, according to the May 4th, 98 edition of The Observer, wanted Flair to make some sort of admittance that he was apologizing over the problems to allow Bischoff to save some face after telling the other wrestlers that Flair was done with the company. During the ongoing standoff, Flair became persona non grata as far as WCW was concerned. His name was no longer to be mentioned on WCW programming. All mentions of him, both contemporary and historic, were removed from WCW's website, while his merchandise was discounted, according to an ad on the site that curiously closed with the line, "Internet fans don't read anything into this." WCW may have gone dark on Flair, but the fans hadn't. WWF and WCW both seemed to conveniently run a slew of events in the Carolinas at the onset of this madness, as not only was there pro-Flair fervor at Greensboro and Unforgiven, but fans at a Thunder taping on April 22nd in Columbia openly chanted for Flair. ECW happened to run their May 3rd WrestlePalooza pay-per-view in Marietta, Georgia, and fans chanted "Free Ric Flair" during the tag team title match. On the lighter side of the situation, the internet ballot box for People magazine's 50 Most Beautiful People in the World was stuffed by Flair supporters, who managed to get the Kiss Stealer himself as high as second place, behind only Howard Stern whackpacker Hank the Angry Drunken Dwarf. But enough silliness, let's get back to serious matters. On May 18th, one day after Eric Bischoff called out Vince McMahon for a fight at the Slamboree pay-per-view, which is a story for another day, Flair countersued WCW in an attempt to get his agreement with the company nixed. Once more, Flair sought a restructured deal with WCW, which would include, among other concessions, travel days to count toward his contracted amount of dates, the inability to fire him unless he no-showed without a plausible reason, with a 15-day window to rectify the situation, and a hefty payout were he to suffer a career-ending injury due to the 3-year contractual period, based on the remaining financial terms of his deal. The Wrestling Observer also notes that per the suggested restructuring, a breach on WCW's part would free Flair from the company, but a breach on Flair's behalf would trigger a 120-day non-compete period upon termination. Meanwhile, Flair's camp was still contending that the letter of agreement from November of 1997 did not constitute an actual contract. His Charlotte-based attorney, Bill Deal, claimed that this letter was just an outline of proposed economic terms that hadn't been agreed to, and further alleged that the promotion had reneged on its promise to afford Flair more dignified treatment. Settlement talks continued as June wound down, with the company hoping to get Flair back on TV for the July 6th Nitro from the Georgia Dome, the night in which Goldberg plowed through Hollywood Hogan to capture the world title. But the date came and went, and Flair was still on the sidelines. The day before that massive Georgia Dome card, an article on Flair and WCW's predicament ran in the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, in which he was quoted as saying, "If you don't have to take it, you shouldn't, and I just drew the line. I had been vented on one too many times." Many in WCW had come to believe that Flair would never return to the company, his relationship with WCW and Eric Bischoff irrevocably severed. The dueling lawsuits looked to be too much to get the sides back on the same page. But Flair ultimately chose to cut a deal with WCW. According to the wrestling great, he believed his lawyers had what it took to defeat WCW and Turner's legal department in court. However, he felt that, in his own words, the time I would have to spend in court would have ended my wrestling career. At 49, Flair's future in the ring was far from assured, and unconditional retirement could have been around any upcoming corner. Of course, we didn't know then that he'd still be taking bumps in TNA in 2011 at age 62, but nobody's a psychic. Alas, a settlement was reached. For a little while, none of the off-camera chaos and tension mattered. On Monday, September 14, 1998, before a sold-out crowd in Greenville, South Carolina, deep in the heart of Flair country, Arn Anderson presided over the reunion of the Four Horsemen. Dressed to the nines, he flanked himself with equally dapper prior members J.J. Dillon, Chris Benoit, and Steve McMichael, as well as new addition Dean Malenko. Double A then teased the end of the segment before knowingly feigning forgetfulness. After a beat, he blurted out, "My God, I almost forgot the Fourth Horseman." Swiftly, he pointed to the entranceway, bellowing Flair's name to a roar unlike anything you've ever heard at a wrestling event. After letting the uplifting strains of his theme play amid the deafening cheers, a tearful Flair, tuxedo and all, emerged from the entranceway, once more allowed back into the house he built. 5 months of legal posturing took a backseat to the moment, but the bitterness didn't fade so easily. Flair's genuine humility at the onset gave way to the hard feelings as he cut the promo of his life on Bischoff. When the on-screen NWO boss, Per the Work, stormed the ring to confront Flair, he was loudly called an overbearing asshole and a no-good son of a bitch by a defiant red-faced Nate, to an even louder response before the ceremony suddenly faded into commercial. It may have been one of the greatest moments in the history of Monday Nitro, possibly the most emotionally charged at the very least. And yet, it almost didn't happen. In the days prior, a dispute between Flair and WCW reared itself, almost resulting in Flair's return being put on hold. Thankfully, that unspecified hang-up was rectified on Sunday, and Flair got to make his long-anticipated comeback. It really seems like there could have been so many possible outcomes. How different could things have been had Flair jumped to WWF in 1998? Does the aging icon become Vince McMahon's choice of corporate champion in a feud with Stone Cold? Who does he face at Mania 15 or WrestleMania 2000? Or what if legal proceedings continue? Does WCW go under while Bischoff and their representation are still duking it out in the courts? Instead of all those what-ifs, we got a Horseman reunion. The final one, it turned out, a Nitro moment for the ages, and the migration of Flair and Bischoff's real-life animosity into an on-screen angle. After all, truth is stranger than fiction, and when presented as a story, it's usually much more fascinating than anything a writer could come up with.